Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Business for South Africa Mental Wellbeing webinar. We're going to dive straight in. The purpose of the webinar is to give you, as the business community, tools that you can use both with yourselves, but specifically also with your staff and those that you are responsible for, to deal with the mental well-being effects of COVID-19, which have obviously been very significant, I think, for all of us. Along with that, we want to point out that the additional stress of considering the vaccination program is something that has added to the already considerable burdens of COVID-19 as people consider how to take the vaccine themselves and what to do with their families as well. As you know, our position as Business for South Africa is very much that we want to encourage everybody to get vaccinated as quickly as possible, with a particular emphasis on those in high-risk groups, particularly those who are older, so over 60s, over 50s, over 40s, and so on. We are a couple of weeks away from opening up to over 18s, at which point the entire adult population of South Africa will be faced with this choice, as will everybody within your staff and employ. So to jump straight in, we have the chair of today's panel discussion, Cassie Chambers. She will soon be taking over, and we have a panel of experts, Dr. Kalinda Linde, Dr. Nolotando Nematswerani, and Neil Bierbaum. I will now hand over to Cassie, who will take you through the program, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions as the event unfolds, and we will be recording it, and it will go out. Links to the recording along with the materials will go out in the B4SA newsletter, which comes out on a Tuesday next week. With that, thank you very much. Cassie, let me hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and good morning to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on a Friday to talk about this incredibly important topic. And perhaps I am a bit biased at thinking mental health should be a priority. So I really do welcome you today. And just to remind everyone, we'd love for this to be as interactive as possible. It's an organic conversation around this topic. It's not a doom and gloom lecture. We really want to focus today on practical tips and tools to help you, your company, your business, or even just your colleagues in your team. So please do, to get started, post, who you are, where you're joining us from, or which company you're representing. It's always nice in our new physical distance world to try to connect. So we'd love to see who is all joining us today instead of just black screens. So please introduce yourself in the chat box. And just another reminder, if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share, please post them in the chat box throughout the discussion, and we'll come through to it at the end for a Q&A and really get to answer your key questions. So as many of us have known and been tracking, it's crazy to think that we're now 18 months in our COVID pandemic ourselves. I think when we're looking at mental health and the mental well-being of our companies, our employees, our families, our friends, it's really important to note that both internationally and even here in South Africa, that mental health has been deemed the second pandemic to come out of COVID. And when we have to relate this to our companies and businesses and in the workplace, where we're already seeing an increase in unemployment, financial strain, stress, pressure, burnout, so many of these different factors that are really contributing to our overall mental well-being that we're not able to switch off when we switch on for work. And this is why this discussion today is so key and so important. There's still also a lot of stigma around mental health, and especially mental health in the workplace. The fear of disclosure, the fear that others will think that I'm weak or less than. And when we again look at the figure that 1 in 4 South African employees do have depression, it's important that we take this conversation seriously. And to deal with all these issues today, I've got a great panel of experts. And we're going to be discussing currently where we are now, 18 months into COVID, what have our different experiences been like, and practical tips and tools that we can take from here. So please let us know what you're needing and what you're looking for from this discussion and what you want us to address in the panel Q&A. I'm going to start off now and ask Dr. Kalinda Linde just to help us with opening up the conversation. We've all heard a lot about anxiety and stress and burnout and compassion fatigue, and We're hearing a lot around these different topics, even within our own workplaces, even many of us feeling that same way currently where we are. So maybe Dr. Kalinda, we can just start with you. If you can just tell us the difference between burnout, compassion fatigue, and depression.
Let me unmute myself. Okay, so thank you again to Business for South Africa and Cassie, all of my panelists, my colleagues. Thank you very much for being here and for inviting us. And I second what you said, that the mental health pandemic is the second pandemic, and yet only 5% of the national budget on health is used for mental health. Anyway, let's not get onto our tirade here. So the context is shifting all the time. So something that people often say is that we're in the same boat, we're in the same boat. And I would actually like to say we're not. We're in the same storm, and we're definitely not in the same boat. So everybody sitting listening today is going to be feeling different in terms of resilience, in terms of what their sleep's like, in terms of what their stress is like. So please be very aware that your boat is different. It's changing all the time. And even if you're somebody who's normally quite resilient, maybe you've got a bit of a leaky boat at the moment. So maybe you're okay, but your staff are not okay. So just be aware that everybody around you, who you work with, your team, who you lead, who leads you, we're all in different boats. Okay, so let me start with that. And then if we talk about, I think that is a very pertinent question, depression, burnout, compassion fatigue. They look very similar, but let's talk about the key differences. So if we start with depression, depression is a cluster of symptoms, and it normally doesn't start there. It starts with the other two and it gets there. So depression is where it ends up. And when it's there, it's pretty obvious. And that's when you do need to take action, please. So the first cluster of symptoms is around mood. So I say this to you as people who lead businesses and people who are working with others, and also yourselves. So the first cluster is mood. So for 2 weeks at a time, you either feel completely numb, or you're very weepy and you just get upset for no reason, not necessarily angry, but really miserable solidly for most of the time for 2 weeks. With that, you have a sleep problem. So you either have initial insomnia, you can't fall asleep, and this is every night, or you can't stay asleep, or you have very patchy sleep, or the other end, you sleep for 12 hours and you still want more sleep. So when those two happen together for at least 2 to 4 weeks, with at least 3 symptoms like loss of motivation, loss of libido, loss of concentration, short-term memory problems, can't think properly, brain fog, decision-making problems, that is pointing you in the area of depression. Now, the difference between depression and burnout is that burnout, you're also exhausted. Maybe you also have some of that agitation. You just feel overwhelmed, it's too much. But the difference is that it only functions 5 days a week. So by the time you get to Friday, it's Friday. So I'm sure a lot of us are thinking that anyway, but burnout is when you live for the Friday, just, okay, 2 more days, 1 more day, so many more hours. And on Saturday morning, your exhaustion is gone. Your mood is wonderful. So you bounce out of bed, hello world, and you carry on like that. And then by Sunday afternoon, after lunch, that the blues begin. And by Monday morning, I don't want to be doing this. Okay, so that's what burnout is. So it's not pervasive like depression. So those are those two. Then the next one is compassion fatigue. So, in the old days, it used to just be the caregivers, your nurses, your teachers, your social workers. Now it's everybody, and it's also leaders. It never used to be leaders quite like this, depending on what kind of a leader you are. So compassion fatigue has 3 stages. The first one looks like burnout and depression. You're exhausted. It doesn't matter how much you sleep. It doesn't matter if you take a week off, 2 days you're back and you're exhausted again. But the third stage is a bit different. So stage 2 only women tend to do, which is very much questioning, self-doubt, what's the point? So if you're a leader and you're questioning, am I even making a difference? That is more unique to compassion fatigue, because from a helping, empowering perspective, you feel I'm worthless. And then at the end, stage 3, which is where men tend to go straight to, is where you're cynical and you just don't care. And you're like, whatever, I don't care, just get on with it. And you're very abrupt and you just feel kind of nothing. So you're not depressed, as in a sad feeling, you feel nothing and you're cynical. And the burnout is more just work is the enemy. Everything else is fabulous. So you can see that it's the kind of thinking that would also give you a clue as to which of these three you were working with.
Thank you for that. And I think that frames it really nicely, just how to pick up on the signs and symptoms, and probably explaining a little bit about how we're feeling so far into COVID. And I know that you've recently written an article around this, and we've been slowly hearing about it more and more in the press, but we've heard this languishing. And maybe you can unpack that a little bit as what is COVID languishing?
You know, when I first heard the word, I thought, well, you know, languishing makes me think of lying on a lounger on an island somewhere. But anyway, turns out that's not languishing. So it's a new word. So psychology always comes up with words, because if you can name something and kind of ring fence it, you can do something about it. So languishing is what we used to perhaps call functional depression, or the walking wounded. And I think this is across the board. Okay, but don't worry, I see Neil's on the panel, and he's going to talk about motivation and flow, I think. And that's one of the antidotes of languishing. So I'm going to first just explain the problem. Okay, so this is a term, I made a note here. It's a sociologist called Corey Keyes who came up with this term a number of years back. And basically it's halfway. So we're talking about it as the mood of 2021. It's not quite depressed, because you're not suicidal, you're not that level of miserable, but you're certainly not flourishing. So it's almost like surviving. Or think of the meh emoji. You know, you kind of just have joylessness. You just kind of, everything's just gray. And you're going through the motions. So if you've got your staff and you see that they're coming to work, we used to also call it presenteeism. So you're coming to work and you're going through the motions, and the second it's time to leave, you just drop everything and you're out of there. So languishing has a lot to do with that. So you're not kind of excited by anything, but you're not depressed. So somebody says, okay, we're going to do this new thing at work. Okay. That thing's been cancelled. Sorry. Okay. So it's that kind of languishing deadness. And so it's for me almost more dangerous than depression, because it's like a slow unraveling and just surviving. So what are you going to do about that? So one of the antidotes is flow. And, you know, we can talk more about that later, but work is actually good for you. So that's one way around it. And flow just activates you and kind of juices your brain, and you can actually feel the difference. And then nature is another thing that's quite helpful. So, you know, I've got plants all over my office, trees all over, and it definitely makes a difference. So have a window if possible, or if not, you know, maybe there is a courtyard or something like that where there could be some nature. And if you haven't got any of that at work, try and have nature breaks. It really does make a difference neurologically and on many levels. In addition to that, try and find something that you enjoy, you know, something juicy. So even if it is watching a particular series or baking something, it doesn't have to be spectacular, just a little thing. So anything that you enjoy. If you to kind of make to bake, maybe you go to a place that sells very interesting cupcakes and find one that excites you. So you're looking just for that little bit of juice to pull you out of that gray. So those are just some ideas on how you can actually work around it.
Thank you for that. And I'll definitely share the link to that article, because I know that you unpack some other helpful tips, which is also great to kind of take that nugget and share it with all of our different groups, and even just to learn from it. And I think just the last question before we move on, what is the impact of not treating mental health in the workplace? You know, especially within our companies and our groups, what is the risks if we don't take mental health seriously, or if we don't get help for mental health?
You know, if we take a medical analogy, there are some things you can leave, like a cold, and it'll go away on its own. And maybe if you don't have the genetics, say for anxiety or depression, maybe it's just a situational thing where right now you're under pressure, there's a deadline, and you know you're not behaving so well, and maybe you comfort eating or drinking. So if it's ring fenced like that, it's not really a problem. It's like a cold. But if it's a condition, think of something like diabetes or even cancer. You know, if you just leave it and it'll get better, it won't get better. So maybe 50% of depressions, if you leave them completely, within 6 months, 50% of them will resolve. That is true, but we don't know who's who. And it's a horrendous 6 months. And, you know, from a work perspective, that person is actually costing you, because mood-wise, they're bringing it all down. It is a little bit infectious in that way. Not that I want to stigmatize it, but people around you start to feel heavy and not very nice. And languishing definitely is infectious. So we want to nip that in the bud very quickly. So I would say, know what it is you're dealing with. Knowledge is power. And then take action fast. So once you've got that mindset, you can then start looking, well, who do I need? SADAG has a fantastic website. You know, you can start speaking to people, you know, more specifically around that employee. This is what I see, what's going on. But definitely don't leave it. No.
Thank you so much for that, Clinda. And we're definitely going to come back because there's so much more again to unpack. And we're just starting to scratch the surface. And this is where I'd love to bring Neil in as well to kind of unpack, you know, it's so strange. And we've been talking about it a lot recently, is that we still remember for the first time as a country, we had to go into lockdown, and what we thought was going to be 3 weeks. And we all had our list of things that we were going to do and prepare, and going into 3 weeks, which now has turned into nearly 18 months. And it seems like it's been obviously so much longer than any one of us expected. Many of us didn't even imagine having a second wave, let alone a third wave. And it just feels like we're constantly getting hit by all these different things. And then we add on things like the looting, loss of loved ones, you know, getting COVID, our families being impacted by COVID. There's been so much that's been happening, and so many different issues. How do we maintain hope, especially for managers and leaders and looking after colleagues, even in some degree, even for our family and our children, especially now when it feels like there's no obvious light at the end of the tunnel? How do we find some hope during these times? Oh, sorry, Neil, I think you're on mute. Sorry. There you go.
Am I good?
Yes, perfect. Can
Okay.
hear you. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. Thanks. It's a great question. And yeah, I think the important thing with hope is we have to distinguish, you know, obviously there's the exhaustion and when things have just gone on too long. And one of the important things to recognize about hope is that it's not wishful thinking or positive thinking or trying to convince yourself. You know, as long as you're doing that, you're in a process where you're lacking hope and you're trying to compensate for it. So real hope needs to be made manageable, and usually there's some criteria involved in activating hope. And it's the same old thing of, you know, we need to have a vision and a commitment. It needs to be realistic. It needs to be something that we can look forward to. And obviously when there's a lot of stuff, long-term uncontrollable things going on, that might become difficult. So a couple of things that people can do for themselves, I would say, like at an individual level, and we can, maybe it's about educating people about what they can do to you know, balance themselves in this regard and create hope, generate hope for themselves. One of that is, for example, not focusing too much on individual events. Like now the looting's happening and we focus on that, and then it's you know, we lose the second or the first test to the Lions, and we focus on that, or whatever it happens to be that adds to the stress. And you know, and recognizing that the news apps and social media are really designed to hook us in for that next feed, that next bit of drama, and that's, you know, those two things kind of work together. So recognizing that, not getting over focused on events, because if you look at it, 6 weeks ago there was some event, and 6 weeks before that there was some event. Today there's some event, and 6 weeks time there'll be some event. And so a lot of these things do take care of themselves, they resolve themselves, and we need to be able to pull back and not get over focused on the individual stories and what social media is designed to do, which is to hook us in on that drama. So those are some of the things about, you know, being able to pull back in that way. You probably find taking a, you know, spiritual view, you know, people's spiritual practices can help them in this regard as well. So encouraging them to take more time out, have a broader philosophical view, and then at a practical level as well, you know, creating. So the other thing is about creating micro levels of hope, you can kind of say. So something to look forward to. If you think about, let's say, a sales context, if you get a new prospect in, if you've ever worked in sales and you get a new prospect in, or let's say you get the prospect of a promotion, just think about how your energy shifts in that moment, because there's something to look forward to, some possibility that suddenly comes in. You know, your energy shifts that day, the next day, and so on. And so what's really powerful is if people can learn to create opportunities for themselves. So if they're stuck at home and they can't, you know, get out, how about, you know, constantly creating a Zoom call with some friends or some kind of event. So you have to get a little bit creative with it, but you need to be able to create small things for yourself that you can look forward to. I guess you asked from a leader and organizational point of view, and I know a lot of our audience is there as well. And I think that's part of it as well. Is, you know, we still need to have that long-term vision, the corporate vision. It becomes more important for people to buy into that, but also maybe breaking that down into smaller, you know, can we create quarterly goals? Can we create community-related activities that the company is involved in that people can contribute to, and look forward to an outcome in 6 weeks or, you know, each quarter, for example. So it's always about a future-oriented event that inspires hope, that is realistic, that requires some commitment and engagement, and, you know, trying to bring that down into sort of not just an annual goal, but a quarterly goal, a monthly goal within teams as well. Maybe, you know, leaders can be shown how to create micro goals for their teams that can give people just smaller doses of hope more consistently. So, you know, the first person to achieve X gets a Uber Eats meal delivered to their home or something like that. You know, these are ways that we can get creative in kind of bringing it down into the more manageable level.
Thank you for that. And I think, you know, breaking it down into those small pieces and reminding people that we don't, as leaders, as managers, have to have all the solutions and know how to fix it, but it's breaking it down into these smaller, realistic goals that we can actually set. And maybe coming to you, Neil, as a executive business coach, and you've worked with, you know, top corporate and business leaders who are now having to manage big teams. What are some of your suggestions from a coaching point of view that we can help teams stay a bit more connected or even motivated, especially like Linda was mentioning, languishing, which I think a lot of us are all feeling? How do you as a manager then motivate and connect your team?
Absolutely. I think, you know, those two at the moment are very interconnected, which is people feeling connected and motivated. And I think one of the things we've put a lot of focus on mental health. And my experience, motivation in itself has sort of been a little bit neglected. It's like, oh, well, that's hardly important. And also motivation in some senses has a bit of a bad name. It's like, you know, those motivational speakers used to come on stage and say, life is a gift. That's why we call it the present. And then they'd rush off and everyone would be like, wow, you know, that lasts about a day and then fades away. And I think with the development of coaching, we've understood motivation better. And I give a talk which I call Making Monday Great Again, and it's based on my 5 motivational states model, and it talks very strongly into what Kalinda talked about. So, for example, they found that the conditions for the flow states, when, you know, this is scientific studies, the conditions for people getting into that optimal state of performance and motivation, which is called the flow states, researched by Csikszentmihalyi, that happens twice as often at work, in a work context, than it does at home, because work tasks meet all the conditions for that. And yet, what is everybody trying to do? Get to Friday. And why? Because we think, well, there's the weekend and time off, and we feel great on a Friday. But maybe the reason we feel great on a Friday is because work has been putting us into that flow state more often than not during the week. Weekend, we drop off into the, you know, sometimes get into that languishing state. I call it NUI. We rest for a little bit too long, and then it's difficult to get back. And the reason why we struggle on Monday is because we've been out of that state for a couple of days, or struggle to get back after holiday. So, you know, I think understanding this and learning getting individuals to understand how they can recognize what work is doing for them and use their work tasks to reinforce and motivate themselves. One of the problems is that people have tended to become a little bit overdriven to compensate for not going into the office. They end up working late. Technology has broken down those boundaries. So we're working from 7 a.m., on average 2 hours extra a night. So part of it is also setting those boundaries and doing what I call leaving at the peak of the party. So I always say, when you're resting, we always think, if rest is good, then more rest must be better for me. Not necessarily. It's the same with coffee, alcohol. If a little bit is good, more doesn't necessarily equate to better. So leaving at the peak of the party, having the right amount of rest and getting back into action. But also when you're motivated and you're in action, also understanding that there's a limit to that, and then you need to cut out into rest. So that self-management and self-motivation works together. And I think we need to give some more attention to that, because I think when people are correctly motivated and not over-motivated or under-motivated, then we can take care of some of those, that languishing context that is talked about. So that would be the one on motivating. And then connecting, obviously, that's a challenge as well, in terms of people getting, when we're not together, we don't have those water cooler moments where we can read the temperature of the room or suss people out, and also where useful information exchanges hands, like we discover something's going on. There's little synchronistic moments that are quite where creativity happens. And so one of the challenges in the hybrid workspace and working from home is to create those kind of scenarios. We need to, again, get creative. How do we have a conversation that is not just work focused? Now we're coming together, we have the Zoom meeting, and then we tune out. How do we get those connections in between? Maybe you've got to have a separate communication channel for the team, a WhatsApp group in which you create a theme, so people have to find out something about who's doing what, and exchange that personal information. That enables you to read the room, gauge each other's moods. Because one of the things I've experienced as leaders wondering, are people telling me the truth about how they're doing? And how do I really find that out? And maybe there's other communication channels where you can create that second, stream of communication where people can connect like that.
And I think that's really helpful, because it kind of leads to my last question to you before we move on. But I think such an important one around the big debate a lot of companies are finding themselves at the moment. Some are getting employees to go back to work and to work in an office again and go to that traditional idea of working, and others have agreed to have people still work from home. And we're kind of in this limbo. A lot of people are watching others. How is it working? How is it not working? And I think we've learned so much about, are we good at working from home? And I've heard a term about homing from work and working from home. What are you seeing? What are some of the pros and cons around going back to the office, working from home? And you've mentioned earlier boundaries, with time and things like that. What are you seeing from your practice?
I'm seeing it in both directions. I'm seeing some clients giving up office space, letting it out, or not renewing leases, and going almost entirely online, especially in the IT space. I mean, I've got one client who he was recently promoted from head of an IT for South Africa to the EMEA. So now he's running the whole EMEA region, and he's not even going to move. He's going to stay in Joburg. So there's an opportunity, where we can choose our lifestyle and how we operate. I'm seeing other people who are getting frustrated and saying, no, we want everybody back in the room. And I think at the end of the day, people are learning to optimize. So they're not traveling for unnecessary amounts of time to have a meeting when you can do it online, and recognizing that there are times when it's better to do it that way. One of the key thing, though, is that if we can use this to become more efficient, are we going to then just fill that space with more busyness? Or are we going to actually set boundaries and say, okay, we've saved ourselves an hour of travel time a day. Am I now just going to fill that with busyness, or am I going to use that productively? Because for years I've been saying I need an hour to go to gym. Now I'm traveling. I'm not traveling, but I'm still not going to gym, because the cult of busyness, and that's what I call busyness as a badge of honor, and we see busyness as a sign that I must be doing something right, instead of seeing it as maybe I'm being inefficient and just allowing the busyness to fill the space that's available. So that's what I think we have to guard against. And it's a cultural thing. Whenever I talk about this, people say, well, what do you do about it? Because, and often the solution is, well, we have to challenge that as a culture in the organization, the culture of busyness as a badge of honor. I would leave that as a challenge out there.
What a great way to end. And I can already see some discussion happening in the chat box. So Neil, I'm sure we're going to be coming to you very, very soon in our real panel discussion. And thanks for those insights. And I think it leads then into these conversations in the workplace and within our teams. And I'd really love to kind of invite Dr. Nolatondo, who's joining us from Discovery. And I think, we have worked really closely together over the years, and we've often had this discussion around the stigma of talking about mental health, both in our society and our communities, even more so here in our workplaces and within our companies and around the boardroom table. And, from your experience and a huge advocate for mental health as well, how do we start to break the stigma around talking about mental illness or sharing our own issues with mental health struggles, especially within the workplace?
Thank you so much, Cassie. Thank you to B4SA for inviting me to participate in this webinar, which I believe is a very important topic for us to address. We are in a mental health pandemic. And I think for me, I always take learnings and lessons from, the HIV epidemic that we have dealt with in South Africa, where, if you think about HIV, a highly stigmatized condition that I think most of the workplaces had to deal with. And the one important thing is that when we talk about physical health, we've been focusing on, screenings for non-communicable diseases in terms of diseases of lifestyle. And mental health was almost put aside. And I think we've seen this even in the early days of HIV, where we would screen for everything else, and then you go there and you have your HCT. Until we integrate mental health and make it part of your wellness interventions, you will continue to see it, as a standalone and a stigmatized condition. So I think for me, integrating mental health into our wellness offerings is the first start. So there can never be health without mental health. And therefore, whenever we have physical health discussions, we must be, if we're talking about screening for diabetes, screening for hypertension, it must also be including screening for mental health. And it must just be normal. Once we start having that integration, it allows then for mental health to be almost normalized, if I can put it that way. People will feel much more comfortable. I'll give an anecdote. When we used to do screenings, like I'm saying, we used to do HIV screenings, and we used to do blood pressure, diabetes, weight, and BMI screenings. And it was very interesting that the HIV line used to be very short, and everybody was going this way, because it was easier to do this, because nobody, if you're coming out of there looking a bit sad, they would not be thinking maybe you're HIV positive or whatever. Until we integrated our screening offering, so that when you go in and do everything. You do your blood pressure, blood glucose, whatever, and HIV. Everyone took the offering because now it was integrated into a broader offering. And I think when we think about how we structure our wellness, programs within the workplace, mental health needs to be, an integral part of our wellness offering. And I think the other important thing, like you said, Cassie, is really around also having champions within the workplace that are going to speak openly about their own challenges with mental illness. And also, just that creates, it normalizes mental health and mental illness issues. And I think we saw it with HIV. I mean, Judge Edwin Cameron became a very prominent figure, came out and spoke about his own status. And we've seen this, in other companies as well, where there were people who are vocal enough to actually champion some of these conversations and destigmatize the condition in that process. So I think that's really that. It's really making those conversations regular, integrated into the broader wellness offering, and also getting champions within the companies to actually lead those conversations.
And thanks for that, because I think it's an important thing that we can all practice. We often think as leaders, we'll wait for employees to come to us, or if the topic comes up in a meeting or in a discussion, But sometimes having to share our own experience around mental health, or if we're struggling or feeling stressed and being a bit vulnerable, can actually create that safe space to talk about mental health. And what suggestions would you have for a leader or a manager? How do we create more of those safe spaces in the current way that we're working, where everything is online or via email? How do we create, as managers and leaders looking after teams, how do we create more safe spaces?
Thanks, Casey. I think it starts with firstly having authentic discussions and dialogues within our workplaces, because you need to build trust. When people feel that it's just another tick box, you're just doing it because everybody else is doing it, then there's no buy-in, and people don't feel that the environment is safe enough for them to be able to come forward with their issues. And I think it also, people always use other, case studies to see how was somebody else treated when they opened up about their own, mental well-being. Were they stigmatized? Was there different treatment? Because then they take that and say, okay, what is it? If I also come out, then it may not be safe for me to have these open discussions. So I think it's building trust. And I think because, in the work environment, we can't say everyone has got the expertise to actually drive these conversations. It's important to tap into, experts who can actually try and come and assist in creating those safe spaces for people to come forward. But I think whenever you create that safe space, there must be processes in place to say, when people do come forward and there are specific requirements, how do you then transition them to either programs that are going to assist them going forward? Which maybe leads me to, do you have an employee assistance program, that supports your employees if you pick up any issues? Do you have a screening program that's similar to what I spoke about in terms of physical screening, that people can go and be assessed, and if there is any risk that is identified, then transitioned to some form of care? So I think it really becomes a holistic approach to how we think about mental health.
Yes, and I think it's also really leads to what kind of resources are available, what kind of support mechanisms, that whether you're a corporate, a big corporate, or a small business, what are some of the resources that you could be using for yourself, because we want to practice good mental health ourselves as leaders, but also for our employees and staff? So,
and I think for me, that's why we must think about it in different buckets. We think about promotion. So, I'm coming from a company that, we're very pro physical activity. And I think physical activity, like we've spoken about it, in the context of non-communicable diseases, where you reduce, the risk of diabetes, hypertension, and other related, non-communicable diseases. But we know that there's good evidence for physical activity and mental well-being promotion. So I think companies should think about how you integrate physical activity as part of your wellness offering, because it not only helps with other conditions, but it also improves the mental well-being of your staff. So I think it's really about looking at some of those physical activity resources that you can incorporate and deploy in your workplace. The second piece is really about ensuring that the employees have got access to screening, like I spoke about screening briefly. So mental well-being assessments, I'm going to talk from where I'm coming from, because some of these are they are validated tools for anxiety, depression, to actually start picking up, some of these issues early on, before people, have got established mental illness. But even when you do then have established mental illness, is really about understanding what are the benefits that are available out there. And depending, it's regardless of which medical scheme you belong to, there are, medical scheme benefits that, the employees can tap into, so that they can be supported and, treated accordingly. And employee assistance programs are also very important, because they can also, employees can tap into these. And we know that the uptake is usually not that great with employee assistance programs, but it's also because of the link with the employer. And it's really about trying to maybe position these as tools and assets that are there to help the employees, and the employer is really not going to use any of that information, in a punitive manner, or in a manner that is going to disclose, the employees, mental status. So I think it's really tapping into some of those tools. And if the employer does not have some of those, it's really looking out and seeing who are the available partners out there who can assist in creating some of those for the workplace.
And to add to that as well, Nalu, I think is so important is that looking at what do you already have in your basket, your medical aid, your EAP program. And one of the steps as a leader is to make sure that your staff and your team know that there is an EAP and the contact process and the referral pathways. Because all too often, especially from SADC's perspective, when we're dealing with callers, they often don't know about their EAP services or the benefits that are available. That would be the first step. And again, for smaller businesses who perhaps don't have the luxury of big teams and being able to afford an employee assistance program, there's various other resources and people can reach out to SADC. I've seen some questions in the chat box and I'll put our details there. There's so many different resources, support groups, free counseling, even employee assistance programs, but for smaller organizations and companies, even if you're a team of 10 employees. And I think the biggest message there is that there is help. And it's so great to see all the chats and the engagement in the chat box. And this is where I'd love to bring in all the panelists. And we're going to have, really just open up this engagement even further. So if you allow me to bring everyone to the screen. I see, and Dr. Kalinda, I think I'll start with you. We've seen a couple of questions pop up in the chat box, and we also see this quite often at SADC, and especially now after the third wave, we've seen a lot more people that have had COVID or have had loved ones who've had COVID and even have lost loved ones to COVID. And I think now we're seeing more and more businesses who have lost colleagues to COVID. And that's put a big impact on the teams, on people that are working. What would you say with regards to dealing with grief in the workplace, and perhaps a tip, for a manager or leader, how do we deal with it? How do we talk about this within our teams?
Gosh, that's a huge one. So I think the first one is, if you haven't been through something yourself, it's quite difficult to say, I understand. But you could even say that, you could say that no one close to me has died. I can't imagine how you must be feeling. So I think that's maybe just one tip. Another one is that we have stages of grieving, and they're far worse when death is off time. So if somebody's, say, in their late 80s, they've had a long illness and they die, it's very sad, but then we go through normal grieving, where if there are a lot of off-time deaths, people your age, people younger than you, people who were perfectly healthy and they're just dying, that's quite scary. So I think definitely, I think Neil mentioned it, or maybe I'm sure Nolly has said this before, take breaks. There's only so much capacity you've got. And I think for you as the leaders, people are going to do what you do. So there's that balance between flow and then, being active at work and getting all those wonderful benefits and self-care. So, if you say you've had a loss very close to you, and tomorrow you're back at work and you're just carrying on and you don't want to talk about it and you're fine, that might be your coping mechanism, but it may not necessarily be the best thing to be displaying for people around you. So I'm just saying, you might not think people are watching. Maybe you think they're only watching your business decisions, but they're watching everything. So that's just maybe a little bit of unpacking. And then quickly to remind you, the stages of grieving: shock, denial, bargaining, and look for this if you get stuck in there or if your employees are stuck in there. Stage 2, bargaining. That can be very dangerous. Overthinking, if only and why, and it shouldn't, and all of that. And that is where it leads to blame. And that's where we've got to be careful, because the blame leads to anger. And that impotent anger can either implode in terms of a mental health condition or a physical health condition, even cardiac, we often see, or it can explode where this person becomes impossible as a leader or within the team. After that comes the sadness, and then comes acceptance. I didn't say resignation. So acceptance is actively accepting, and that is where spirituality helps quite a lot. So just be aware that for the first months after a loss or trauma, it is going to be pretty much all those symptoms full on. And then within about 6 months, it should start to have resolved. So these are just some ideas around grieving and loss.
Thank you so much. It is a difficult topic, and perhaps a webinar all in itself to really just unpack that even further, and especially as we see it more and more. But I think it's a great way to start. And I'd also like to now pose to you, we've recently seen an announcement by MTN, who made the brave choice to help prevent burnout and the impact of COVID on their employees' mental health by giving their staff a week off and, paid online leave that they could take, which was quite a big announcement and quite a big step towards kind of mental well-being. Any opinions or thoughts around this, and how you hope that perhaps this could inspire other companies, but also adding in that element that for a lot of companies, especially now, it's quite a risk and it's really hard to give employees a whole week off when we're trying to work so hard. But what are some of the other smaller initiatives that companies or businesses could take that actually looks at promoting or looking after emotional well-being and mental health? Something similar, but not to the scale of MTN. Maybe I can pose it to the panel.
Well, maybe I can make a quick comment and then pass it to my colleagues. So one of them is around the dreaded meetings. So that there are, I'm not going to name names, but there are some organizations where there's, say, a certain day of the week where there aren't any meetings. And there are other ones where they limit them to 30 minutes. Even when I present, I've only got 30 minutes. So it's really about ring fencing. And from where I come, I would be looking at work-life balance as chunks of work and play or life and sleep or rest. So, it's really just putting things into chunks like that. And that certainly helps with the boundary problems that we've been seeing. Well, you're not traveling, so you can have a meeting at 5 or 6 at night. So definitely having just ring fencing those chunks of work, interruption-free zones, meeting-free zones, and then limiting the amount of times. This is a hard stop, that's when the meeting will end. So these are some things I've seen. I don't know about Neil and Nalu.
Yeah, if I can jump in there, I think it's a great gesture and a good start. And I would definitely be more interested in the long-term behaviors and, the cultural thing of, what I call the cult of busyness and, being able to set those boundaries. We invented all this wonderful technology, email. I remember I was working when email was invented and we got called in and we were told, this is what you can do. And we were like, wow, this is fantastic. But did we use that to save time from, carrying stuff around and traveling? Or did we just fill that time with more busyness and then we end up becoming a slave to technology? And it sounds like a sort of humorous and almost trivial thing, but I think this is such an important conversation. And nobody wants to be seen to be the one who to start it. Nobody wants to, challenge on that level. We just naturally go into busy mode. I've got to be as busy as the next guy, and nobody knows where. Like when I present on this in an organization, it's kind of like nobody knows where it starts and where it ends. Like, who do we go to about this matter? Well, we need to challenge the culture of the organization. Who do we go to for that? Well, maybe it's HR, maybe it's your manager, but that's a question that we really need to ask and say, okay, and it's probably more important now than it ever was because there's not cut-off times of, driving home and that. So we start to fill that time. So I think this is a very important conversation in terms of the culture of the organization and allowing people and starting to recognize that doing, taking time out is actually a sign of efficiency and effectiveness, not a sign of laziness or disinterest.
Yeah, really great.
I just want to agree with Neil that you have to look into the company culture, and I think some of these initiatives we must think about how sustainable they are, because we do need to think about long-term sustainability and long-term impact in terms of preventing burnout. And I think with the work from home approach, we know that sometimes the meetings now go into early evening because people they know you there, and I think it's really starting to address some of those behaviors where it's just non-stop and people work over weekend. There is really now the barriers or the boundaries have been blurred. People are living at work. They're no longer working from home. So I think it's really just and it's addressing it from the senior leadership space, because sometimes we do model terrible behavior to our employees, because we're the ones who are answering emails 12 midnight, and people think, should I also be awake at that time and responding, you know? So it's really just addressing the company culture, and it takes a lot, and it takes commitment from senior leadership to make these changes in a more sustainable manner. But we still commend, obviously, some of the small initiatives that actually acknowledge, you know, some of the behaviors that drive poor mental well-being for employees.
And I think it is important that, yes, sorry, Neil, carry on.
There's one comment on the chat there that says France has made a law that, sorry, it's just gone off my screen, that employees have to turn off their tech during leave. In fact, there's some companies, I know Ericsson was the first to do this, and there are others who shut down your email when you go on leave. So you don't come back to 300 or 400 emails, you come back to nothing. And, you know, I know of one person who used to come in on his first day and just delete all the emails, all the unread emails from his leave, and say, if it's important, they'll come back to me, but otherwise it's been resolved. And you know, and he survived, and actually most of the stuff was resolved. So that small thing, you know, would be a very good practice, because, you know, if you take the week's leave and you come back and you've got 400 emails, and while you're on leave, you know that's what you're coming back to, that's not going to help much either.
It's those sustainable measures, and I think it is just through having these types of conversations we can learn more. And I want to try to get to some of the questions, and I know that time is still tight, but we are going to be taking the questions from the chat box and getting answers and sharing that on the B4SA newsletter and information. So the questions are not going to go unanswered. They're going to help us even, you know, just work forward. Here's a question around wellness interventions and programs need to be supported from the top down and by direct line managers. Training leaders in this regard is important. How to identify a colleague in distress or struggling and how to support them. And this question has come up quite a few times in the chat box on having the buy-in from managers and leaders and training them up. And maybe we can come to you, Dr. Noluthando. How important is it to get the top-down approach in taking mental health seriously in the workplace?
I must say we are actually driving something within our own work environment. And I think for me, I insisted that we cannot do it, you know, without top leadership buy-in, because people take it more seriously when they can see that senior leadership actually is invested in this and they are committed to this, because then it just becomes another tick box, you know, initiative, which is what I was saying. So it's critical for people to actually even buy into the programs that you are putting in place in the workplace when they see that top leadership is actually invested in this and they are making time for it. And we can never overemphasize the importance of senior leadership buy-in and actually leading from the front. You know, some of these initiatives, they must be the ones who are actually driving them so that staff can see that this is something that the company is actually committed to.
And that's really, really key. And even, yeah, organizing these talks and discussions with management and including them there around that table, I think is important. Dr. Kalinda, I'd like to come to you around questions around anxiety. I know that this is, you know, a passion of yours, and now throwing in COVID and the big debate around vaccination. And I think for a lot of companies, employees, it's caused a lot of anxiety. And we've got quite a few questions around, have you seen an issue, you know, the vaccination issue driving anxiety, either wanting it or not wanting it? And how can employers encourage employees to get vaccinated, but not feel like they're forcing them to?
Okay, that's a big question. So I think I'm going to talk about it in two pieces. First, anxiety. So anxiety is very much about the unknown. You know, what will happen? And what will the effects be? And will I be one of those with adverse effects? And what if I don't take it? And, you know, those what ifs can fill a week. And so that's definitely where anxiety comes in. It's future fear. Now, you know, often what I like to say to people is, I'm sitting here in my life, and if there's a God or whatever one calls it, that's who gave me these cards to play. And if there is no God, it's still somehow I've got these cards to play. So I can drive myself mad thinking, why have I got these cards and what's going to happen and what cards will I get? Or I can play my cards. And, you know, this is where, and I'm going to ask Neil maybe to talk about this. I've heard him do a talk before on decision making. And he always talks about the word decision from decidere, which means to cut. And I've often said that to my clients, which is when you make a decision with the variables that you've got, thank goodness, you can feel the relief when you make a decision. You just cut off all that other stuff. Was it the right decision? Well, this is what I had to work with at this time. Maybe in 6 months you think, maybe I shouldn't have. Well, you didn't know that then. So, I think for me, that helps quite a lot, just to kind of cut that anxiety spiral. So you make your decision based on facts. What does my doctor say? Maybe get at least 3 opinions, because doctors are people too, they're biased. We know we're going to look at Dr. Google, so please get at least 2 other humans and, who are different. And then you make that decision. You just listen to the still small voice and you make the decision, and then you cut, and that's it. And you do or don't do. So I think that for me is what I would say would be the best way to approach this thing.
Neil, do you want to add to that?
I appreciate Kalinda's comments. I want to come from a slightly different angle, and I'll point back to social media and what we're up against there. So social media is designed to reinforce the prejudices that you have, the biases that you have for or against, and will tend to feed you more and more of that information. And so that's a major, major factor. There's a great book called Anti-Social Media, which is, I can't remember the guy's name, he's got quite a long surname, I can't pronounce it. Fantastic book on the impact that social media is having in this area particularly. So I think part of the challenge there is actually an information challenge that we're facing against people being, through their own connection and social media, are getting a lot of information one way or the other, whether you agree with it or not. And that's where the challenge, the misinformation challenge, comes in. So I think there's that added component in terms of how do we get people to become aware of the way that social media impacts them and the influence that it has on them behaviorally. That's maybe a whole conversation in itself.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. And Dr. Nolu, I've got a question for you from the chat box, and you mentioned earlier about including mental health in the normal health assessments that are happening at wellness or when in the workplace. We have a question as to what assessments will work for including and screening from a mental health and wellness perspective or days. Which ones would you suggest? And I think you mentioned even, internationally validated forms. Maybe you can just chat about that a little bit.
So, and I think the question also talks about virtual, screening, because we do understand the interruption in screenings during the COVID, pandemic. But I think if you look at the screenings that I'm referring to, these are online tools. I mean, we talk about the PHQ-9, the GET7. I mean, we've got experts here, but I think when I think about our mental well-being offering, it really uses some of those validated screening tools. But I think, it is also allowing employers to be guided by experts in terms of what is suitable for screening in, their employees. But those two, when I think about depression and anxiety, are some of the tools that we have used.
Thank you for that. Maybe Kalinda, I can come to you only because I know that you have a website, and when we're looking at resources and sharing practical tips, could you just tell us a little bit about your website and how helpful it could be providing practical, especially to deal with anxiety and stress, practical resources that we as leaders, but as well as with our employees, can be sharing?
Thanks, Cassie. Yes, it's called thoughtsfirst.com, and it's got free CBT resources for anxiety, for stress, a couple of things about sleep. So people can feel free to go and have a look there. And there are a couple of other resources that are linked to that site as well. So I'm going to have to leave in a few moments, but what I would like to leave everybody with would be to say, please, similar to what Cassie asked earlier, your early warning signs. So yes, there's depression, there's burnout, there's all of that stuff, but it all starts with stress, doesn't it? So your early warning signs, and this is a resource on my website, on Thoughts First, there's a stress equation. It's critical that you know, for you as well as the people you lead and your team, what are your early warning signs behaviorally? What are you doing more or less of? More comfort behaviors, sleeping too much, not sleeping. What are your signs physically? What are your signs emotionally? And what are your signs cognitively? What's the cell? Oh, I'm going to avoid this because, or no, I just have to carry on. I just have to carry on. So I'm very passionate about that, about prevention more than cure. So please identify what are your early warning signs, tell people around you, and get the team to not tell on each other, but to actually support each other, as in, that's showing, we need to support you. So prevention, absolutely. And these are the four. These are the four areas in which those signs will come up first.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kalinda. I know that you have to run off. You've got patients. I just really want to thank you very much for your time and your input. And I know, again, this conversation can go on for hours. And I think it's a launch pad to having more conversations and learning more. As we wrap up, I'd like to just come to the rest of the panelists for your last words, your last nugget of wisdom that you can share with everyone, or even just a helpful resource that you'd like to share. Dr. Nolu, I'll come to you.
I think mine is simple. There's no health without mental health. I think I'm just going to reiterate that, and we need to just make sure that it is an integral part of our wellness offering.
Thanks. And I think that is really important, and not only from someone who's passionate about mental health, but having to just keep pushing that message out and normalizing those conversations. So thank you very much for your input, Dr. Nolu. And we'll mention some of those wellness tools and a lot of the resources that are available also on Discovery's website. There's amazing podcasts and articles and webinars. I see a lot of people are wanting information, so we will make sure that that's part of the emailer after today's session. Neil, to wrap up with you, and I think, your one great article about, sharing 10 key tips to share hope during this time. Maybe you can leave us with the message of hope.
Yeah, I think, just to share one more resource, we have, Kalinda and I have collaborated on a project called Practical Mindfulness, and that's available as an online program or a corporate program, practicalmindfulness.co.za. So that's available. And it's when presenting that program that often we get the question of what do we do about the busyness factor, and how do we address that? And that for me would be, one of the key things that I would hope people would really look to address and to normalize and to support people in doing that. And I think in terms of hope, I think we need to just be able to sit back, not over focus on events, but look at the big picture and recognize that 90% of things resolve themselves. I was involved with a client today who is involved in the vaccine process, and they had some major drama and used this principle of allowing things to resolve themselves. And it was a major issue. So it's not like just for the small things that resolve themselves, but the really big things. We need to learn that not everything is up to us having our attention on it. Sometimes things do resolve themselves, and we need to gain a perspective on the bigger picture like that. So trusting that things will resolve themselves.
Absolutely. What a great way to end. And thank you again, just to all the panelists. I really appreciate your insight and your expertise. And just to remind everyone, we will be sharing a recording and all the resources that we discussed today. Please feel free to post your email address in the chat box, and we'll make sure that you get that notification and all of those resources, which we encourage you to share far and wide. Or look out for the next B4SA website newsletter, and on their website, and you'll find that link. Just as we're about to end, I'd like to just share some helpful resources, and this is the time that you're welcome to take a screenshot and keep this on your phone and share it with people. It's just some of the resources that we discussed today, both from SADAG's website, where we've got videos and articles and questionnaires and all kinds of, even those that would like to take part in future mental health talks and webinars, all the information is there. We have Dr. Kalinda's website, thoughtsfirst.com, as well as Neil's details. There's some really helpful international websites that look at mental health and mental health in the workplace if you're looking for ideas and information to share. Also things like the Calm app or MoodFit or Headspace. Some helpful free advice for those smaller businesses who don't have that big budget for EAP. You could look at some of our online Q&A sessions that SADAG runs. 702 does a daily positive psychology podcast that you can actually share for 2 to 3 minutes, and that would be really helpful. Or again, go to the Discovery website. But we'll be sharing a lot of those links and articles in the emailer, so please look out for it. To everyone who's joined, thank you so much for giving an hour of your time on a Friday to really focus on mental health. We really appreciate it and we look forward to engaging with you further. We will share all of our experts' details as well if you'd like to reach out and get further support. And I think, you know, it's a really great way to start the weekend and to end off the week looking at mental health matters. So thank you everyone for your time, and thank you again to all the organizers for putting it together. Really appreciate it. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much. I don't think anyone's thanked you yet. So thank you for chairing the panel. Thank you for the panel, and also thank everybody for your questions and participation. We do these B4SA briefings every couple of weeks. They cover a range of different topics, often updates as to what's happening with the vaccination program, and then tools like this, how to communicate to your staff and your clients and your communities as a business, how to empower people with information, and also sometimes asks that we have of business, big and small, about how they can support health and vaccination in this time of COVID-19. So for everybody who has joined, thank you very much.